The Fusion World beta has come and gone, and with that, honestly, I had a phenomenal time, but I also think there's great opportunity here to get a little bit more polish on everything before we go for a full release. And with that, I'm going to give my quick review on everything I thought about the beta. First thing to kick it off, and the most important thing, honestly, altogether, gameplay was phenomenal. The gameplay feel was smooth, and in general, I always was really excited to be able to make my plays, play my cards, see what my opponent was doing. I think the animations, while some of them lean a little bit long, were generally pretty good. I will say the number one thing, though, is the timer. I actually don't even think the timer was functional as of the beta, because generally it seemed no matter how long I waited, it would never really reward me the win. Now, I will say to those of you who were mad because you think your opponent was slow playing you or was just trying to rope you to hopefully get the win, in reality, it was actually tested that if you close the client and then you rejoined at some point, it would actually join you back into your game. So what was probably happening was that your opponent just decided to shut down the client and it never booted them out. Never assign maliciousness to what you can just assume is just general stupidity sometimes. But nevertheless, the timer definitely needs to be fixed. And if I had to give any recommendations, I would lean it more to the Magic the Gathering style, where you have a set clock of about 30 seconds to a minute per turn, but the faster you play, you accumulate more clock, which means in the early game, if you're at a rapid pace and you get the game going, you actually accumulate more clock for those later turns where you're going to need the additional time to figure out how to potentially close out the game. You could also go for a Master Duel style clock where you just get a full 300-second clock and then you accumulate a little bit over time. I personally wouldn't want that because it doesn't promote early play. Like, hey, it's turn 1, 2, or 3. You don't need to think that much about your turns. You have 1 to 2 card play options. So in that regard, I would really appreciate it if it was more pushed towards getting the game going, pushing for that. And you know what? Hey, you have a quick pace of play, you respond without issues, gain more clock, and from there be able to utilize it in your later turns. Outside of that, though, I really didn't have too much issues. There's a couple of UI stuff, and that's actually gonna be its a whole other category in just a minute. But in general, there's just a couple of knick-knack parts here and there that I would like to see improved going into a full release. First, choosing who goes first. At the moment, this was random. It's fine for a beta, but there's a lot of advantages in the game, even in best of one, on who gets to go first. The energy marker is huge, but there is a world in which some decks would prefer to go first. Generally, I would like to go second, so if I win the die roll, I'd like to go second. But nevertheless, I think that's one of those things where it's a quick button, game starts, give me an option to go from there. Tighter skill-based matchmaking, I think, again, just the beta. I got paired up with like bronzes as I was in gold. I also heard god-ranked players were pushed against bronze. I think that's just a player-based thing. There aren't as many players playing the beta as there will a full release of the game. One of those things I just cough up to the beta, but worth mentioning. Finally, the last thing about gameplay, and it kind of starts sinking into UI territory, is the total battle power of cards after you combo. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that if you click the details of a card, there'll be a little power section on the left side that specifies the total power. But to do that with every single card is kind of obnoxious. I would love for there to be a toggle that specifies what the total battle power of a card attacking is or defending. I've heard some people say like, well, actually, IRL, you're going to have to make that math yourself, so it's just making you the better player. And it's like, no, clearly you've never actually competitively played Dragon Ball. Everyone always refers to battle power as their maximum battle power. And if you happen to be the red deck that cares about base battle power so that you can like neg a card into oblivion or whatever, that is done separately. Generally, we always talk total battle power. Someone says they're attacking for 100,000. I know I need to defend by 100,000. It's not a big deal. I think you get used to it, and I understand why they differentiate combo from your base power. It makes more sense in the context of the rules of the game, but it confuses people, and I've dealt and taken damage quite often just by getting the math wrong, because on the fly, comparing those two numbers isn't the easiest. For most newer players, there's going to be little differentiation between the two, especially since at the moment in red, there are very few cards that actually neg in a way on battle to be able to remove a card. So in general, I think you are better off just having the total BP there with the option to be able to do a split in the settings or something like that, which is a perfect segue to user interface isn't the most important thing, and that's what I will say. Gameplay was phenomenal and felt really good. And in that regard, I don't have too many complaints about the beta. It played the way it should. For the most part, information was conveyed to me in a way that I felt like I could make the best decisions in a timely manner. But nevertheless, there's a lot of UI stuff that I think would really benefit from a spruce up going into a full release. The first thing is the main menu. And look, the title screen is a static image, all right? I don't have any preconceived notions that this is what the final look is going to be on full release. But nevertheless, there's a lot of things in the main menu that make it feel beta. And in that regard, it's like the buttons just kind of don't really match. The general UI of the main menu isn't super endearing. And in general, it just definitely feels like, okay, we got a couple of buttons. They're stylized to generally look like the overall layout. And now we can go ahead and focus on the more important things about the game. But of course, the main menu is the first thing people are going to see. And in that regard, things like buttons and the way that information is conveyed is super important. That leads into deck building. I think deck building was fine. You had the cards on view and you were able to put them into a deck. There are a couple of things here that would be fun for usability. In general, hovering over a card should showcase it in the deck builder instead of clicking it, which if you left click, it adds it to the deck. So you can right click it and makes it pop up into the detail view. But even then, that's having to know what to do. It's not very intuitive and it doesn't take the perspective of like, hey, a new player jumps into this. What will their experience look like? Realistically, when you create a deck, it should be auto filtered into leaders. And the moment you select a leader, it should auto filter to that leader's color. And then more advanced players can remove the filters to be able to experiment and figure out cards and things like that. In general, I think that would lead to a more enjoyable experience when it comes to building a deck, as opposed to having to do all that filtering myself for a process that is pretty automatic. For the most part, every deck starts with a leader, and from there, you're only allowed to build a deck based on the color of that leader. So if the game could just automatically do that, great. For an experienced player like me, I don't particularly mind because sometimes I will just start deck building by saying I want to play this card and this card and this card and kind of figuring out the details after that. But for the newer players, I think a more shepherded experience will go further. And then there's little details like I can't go into my collection without going into a deck editing. Those should just be options I should be able to have outright from the menu as opposed to having to go into the deck editor and go and do the thing. And finally, the biggest thing is probably the mulligan button. And I hate that I'm focusing a lot of my UI issues on one button, but the fact that the mulligan button says check mark change as opposed to check mark keep blows my mind. The option that should be more highlighted should be the one to keep your hand, or just there is some kind of mix up there between the check marks and the X's and the coloring of the buttons. I confuse myself all the time because I automatically just like, oh yeah, this is a good hand. Big button that makes me want to keep my hand. I think this is just kind of one of those things where Bandai, you probably want to switch it, or again, when you spruce up the UI of buttons in general across the game, one of those things that has confused me and caused me to get rid of hands that I really want to keep. And I've seen this as a point of contention across a bunch of people playing the beta. But nevertheless, that's one thing I really pushed for a change because, oh my God. And finally, there is... Now, it's kind of tough to talk about the economy because in the beta, none of it was really expressed. We know that there's an ability to craft cards, but the crafting system was disabled, and the game didn't really provide us any view as to how gems were going to be accumulated in a realistic way. We had daily missions, we had weekly missions, we had lifetime missions, and honestly, it's great to know that there are avenues to be able to acquire gems, and it looks like on a pretty consistent basis. I just don't understand why it was so restrictive for the beta. Effectively, if you played like semi-consistently across all 5-ish days of the beta, you could get yourself about 16 to 17 packs of cards, which, don't get me wrong, can kind of lean you in a direction of which starter deck you should pick up to have an enjoyable experience. But the fact that a lot of the players weren't able to really explore the entirety of the card pool because of how limited the options were didn't feel great, and honestly didn't leave me feeling really great about the free-to-play route that they're leading up to this game. Now, there's nothing we can say about the economy. We don't know how generous these systems will be leading up to the full release of the game. But if the beta was any indication of how friendly they're trying to be, then it's just not even close. I think we need to be in a territory where you could potentially get a pack a day once you've already gotten through the front-loaded first missions and everything, right? I think Master Duel is a phenomenal example of that, where honestly, with a little bit of play, in your first few days, you could probably craft a tier 1 deck. I cannot say the same about the Fusion World client if it's anything like the beta, but this is one of those things where I'm more so saying it as a guide to Bandai if they ever watch this video, more so than criticizing the beta, because I recognize that the economy isn't fully fleshed out. The packs didn't have SRs, it didn't have secret rares, and we couldn't craft. And then there's the fact that you can actually put in card codes and get packs that way, which throws off the math a little bit, but you still need to make the system fun for players who never interact with the real card game, even going as far as getting card codes. It just needs to be a system that feels good. People who download the app need to be able to feel like they can make meaningful progress towards their collection, and the beta didn't really do that. But again, for the sake of the beta, it's fine. Now, I have to double down that I loved the beta. I had so much fun with it. It was an extremely fluid way to play the game. Comboing cards felt great, and it really captured the excitement, especially with the animations. I thought it really brought it all together and made for a smooth package. Everything I'm complaining about are small quality of life things or polish. But if the client released today in the form of the beta, I would still be happy. I thought the ranking system was great. I thought the gambling system on the ranking system was great. I like that there's the spectator modes and you can host lobbies. Honestly, it really beat every single one of my expectations. So I would be happy if it were released in its current state. I just think there's a few instances where with a little more polish, it could make the experience much more well-rounded for any player that's looking to get into the game, not just someone who's incredibly biased and incredibly incentivized to enjoy it like me. But that is just one man's opinion. If you guys want to let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the debate. Did you guys enjoy it? Did you not enjoy it? Why or why not? And with that, we'll catch you on the next one.